Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Welcome. Welcome to everyone who's listening out there in virtual land. I'm so happy to be with you today. Today, I'm going to be sharing stories, folk tales from Japan, stories of the oral tradition. Japan is the country that my grandparents came from over 100 years ago. So the first story is adapted from a collection, Stories Retold by Eric A. Kimmel. The book is Sword of the Samurai. Eric was my college teacher, instructor, and so he gave me permission to share his stories. I call this story Ito's Head. Now once, a long time ago, there was a samurai warrior named Ito. He was strong, brave, and most of all, determined. One day, Ito was walking through the forest, and all of a sudden, a group of bandits jumped upon him. Ito fought back bravely, but a whole group against one. He was soon overcome. One of the bandits whipped out a long sword and whacked off Ito's head. Then the bandits ran off. Now, Ito was not about to let something like this stop him. He got down on his hands and knees and felt around for his head, which had rolled under a bush. He picked up his head, put it under his arm with the eyes facing out, and he walked home. When he walked into his house, his wife took one look and started to scream, "Ah, doshitano, doshitano." Ito said, "Don't just stand there and scream. Do something useful. Go get the doctor." She ran to get the doctor. The doctor came as quickly as he could. When he saw Ito, his mouth dropped open. He said, "Does it hurt?" Ito said, "No, strangely enough, it does not hurt at all." The doctor said, "Well, we have to do something. You can't walk around like this. You'll scare small children." So the doctor mixed up a paste of healing herbs. Very carefully, he spread the paste on Ito's neck, the stump. Then he took his head and put the head on the stump just right. He took a long length of cloth and wound it around Ito's neck and tied it. Then he helped Ito into a large, empty barrel large enough to hold a man. He filled the barrel with raw rice all the way up to Ito's forehead. He said, "Ito, don't move until I return." And he left. 3 days later, the doctor came back. He brushed aside the rice from around Ito's face. He said, "Ito, how are you feeling?" "Not bad. Not bad at all. May I come out now?" "I don't think you're ready yet," said the doctor. He put the rice back. 3 days later, the doctor returned, brushed aside the rice. "Ito, how are you feeling?" "Pretty good, really. I can't complain. May I come out now?" "No, not yet." 3 days later, the doctor came back. "Ito, how are you feeling?" "I feel terrible, horrible. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I ache all over. May I come out now, please?" "Yes," said the doctor. "I think you are ready." He helped Ito out of the barrel. Ito felt his head. He was healed. Now, it is said that warriors of today are nothing like the samurai of long ago. Well, let me tell you, neither are the doctors. Now, I'd like to tell you a few stories about a very famous judge. His name was Ooka. Torasuke Ooka, and he was a real historical person. He really lived. He was so clever. Stories about him spread throughout the entire countryside. He never turned down any case, no matter how impossible it seemed. For instance, there was the case of the stolen smell. A student rented a room above a tempura shop. Now, tempura, you may know, is a Japanese fried food. You take shrimp or vegetables, you dip them in a thick batter and fry them in hot oil. When the shopkeeper would cook his tempura, that good smell would spread throughout the entire building, including the student's room. One day, the shopkeeper overheard the student talking with a friend. The friend said, "I am so poor. I can barely afford food to eat. I can only afford plain white rice, and I'm getting so tired of eating nothing but plain white rice every day." The student said, "Well, I'm just as poor as you are, but I have found a way to make my plain rice taste better. I just wait until the shopkeeper cooks his tempura, and when that good smell spreads through my room, I eat my rice at the same time, and it is much tastier. When the shopkeeper heard this, he was furious. He was a greedy man. He thought people were always trying to cheat him. He went straight to the student and demanded payment for the smell of his food. Pay you for the smell of your food, said the student. Don't be ridiculous. And he refused. Well, the shopkeeper was so angry, he went straight to the court of Ooka, the judge, and charged the student with theft. To everyone's surprise, the judge agreed to hear the case. He said, the man thinks he has a legitimate complaint. We must hear it out. So the next day, the student and the shopkeeper went before the judge. Each man told his side of the story. The judge listened carefully and said, well, it's clear. The smell of the food did belong to the shopkeeper, and the student did enjoy it. Therefore, there is a debt that must be paid. The student was horrified. He didn't have spare money for a fine. The judge said to the student, how much money do you have? Oh, Your Honor, I only have 3 small coins. Good, said the judge. Let's see the money. The student held out his hand. There were the 3 small coins. Excellent, said the judge. Now, I want you to shake the coins like this, and everyone in the courtroom listen to the sound of the coins clinking. Good, said the judge. The debt has been paid, for the price of the smell of food is the sound of money. And then there was the case of the 2 first sons. A wealthy landowner died, leaving his 2 sons arguing over who should inherit the estate. Now, in Japan at that time, the oldest son gets everything, the other kids get nothing. The problem came because these 2 sons were identical twins, and no one knew which one had been born first. The mother had died long ago. The midwife from the night of the birth was long gone. There were no other family members. The boys themselves had never been told who was the older. Well, they argued and couldn't come to an agreement, so the case came up before Ooka, the judge. First, the judge thought maybe the larger son was the older, but he discovered they were the exact same size. So then he investigated their characters. He discovered that one son was honest and hardworking, and the other was a greedy scoundrel. Clearly, one deserved to inherit, and one did not. So the judge called the 2 sons before him. He said, this is an unusual case. You are both first sons. Therefore, we must divide this estate in a fair way. Come back to court tomorrow, bring with you a handful of dirt, a plank of wood, a gold coin, and a drawing of one of your friends or neighbors. And he dismissed them, leaving everyone in the courtroom wondering what this was all about. The next day, the 2 sons returned with the objects which they laid on the table. Very good, said the judge, I'll explain. The handful of dirt symbolizes your father's land. The plank of wood stands for your father's house. The gold coin represents your father's wealth. And the drawing of your neighbor symbolizes the goodwill of your friends and neighbors. Now, we must divide this estate in a fair way. He turned to one son and said, you may divide the estate. I promise you it will be awarded. A crafty look went over that son's face, and everyone in the room knew the judge had picked the greedy son. That son went up to the table, pushed the handful of dirt, the plank of wood, and the gold coin to one side and the drawing to the other. He said, Your Honor, I have often heard my brother say that the goodwill of our friends and neighbors is worth more than anything else. And of course, I agree with him. Therefore, I'll take the land, the house, and the wealth. My brother can have the goodwill of our friends and neighbors. Very clever, said the judge, but not clever enough. I asked you to divide the estate, but not to award it. That is my job. Therefore, I give your brother the land, the house, and the wealth. You may have the goodwill of your friends and neighbors, and you said yourself that that was what was most valuable. So I think you'll agree. It has been a very fair division. Now, once A long time ago, there was a small village ruled over by a young and arrogant lord. He was arrogant, so he thought he knew everything. He was young, so he didn't know much at all. Now, the Lord decided he did not like old people. He would see them sitting in the village, not working, and this irritated him. He said, "Every person in this village must earn his or her way." So he made a decree. Any person who reached the age of 70 should be taken up the mountain and left there to die. Well, of course, the people in the village were horrified, but no one dared disobey. The Lord was known to be merciless. He had soldiers who would carry out his bidding. And so gradually, as time passed, there were fewer and fewer old people in the village, and the Lord was pleased. "Look at my fine village," he would say, "full of young, strong, hard-working people." He did not notice the air of sadness that hung over everything. Now, in this village, there lived a farmer with his aged mother. They lived together happily, but one day she reached the dreaded age of 70. He did not say anything to her, but one day she said, "My son, the time has come. You must take me up the mountain. It is the law." Well, there was nothing he could do. Everyone knew how old she was. The soldiers would do it if he did not. And so one sad day, he put his mother upon his back and began to climb up the mountain. It was slow going. There was no pathway. He was having to find his way around the trees and the bushes. And as he walked, he started hearing noises. It sounded like twigs breaking. He said, "What's that sound?" She said, "Well, my son, I don't want you to get lost on the way down, so I'm breaking off branches and dropping them on the ground. You can follow them and get home safely." He stopped. He said, "I am taking you to your death, and even now you are thinking of me?" She said, "Of course. I'm your mother. I'm always thinking of you." Well, when he heard that, he could not leave his mother on the mountain to die. They waited until the sun went down, and under the cover of darkness, they snuck back to the house. And there he built a secret room under the house. She lived there. He brought her meals 3 times a day. She never came out. She never saw the sun rise or the sun set. She never felt the warm breeze upon her cheek. But every day she saw her son, so she was happy. She lived there for 3 years. And then one day, the Lord received a messenger from Lord Higa of the next town. Lord Higa said, "I like your village. I like it so much I'm going to come and take it over, but I like puzzles too. So I'm going to give you 3 puzzles, and if you can solve them, I'll leave you alone. 1, you must give me 100 ropes made of ash." Ash. 2, here is a log. There is a hole that runs through it from one end to the other, and as it does, it bends back upon itself 7 times. You must thread this log with a silk thread. And 3, make me a drum that makes noise without being beaten. Well, the Lord called together all of his wise men, but they shook their heads. "Sire, these are impossible. Ash crumbles at the touch of a finger. You cannot make 1 rope of ash, much less 100. And as for the log, a needle is straight, the hole is curvy. You cannot thread it with a silk thread. And a drum that makes noise without being beaten, impossible." The Lord dismissed them and said, "I have a village full of young, strong, hard-working people. Surely someone can solve these puzzles." So he went to the middle of the village, put up a sign that offered a bag of gold to anyone who could solve the puzzles. The farmer saw the sign. He went home and told his mother, and she thought and said, "Well, these are not so very difficult. First, the rope. Take rope, soak it well in salt water, dry it very well, lay the rope on a rock, and when it burns, it will hold together. As for the log, take an ant, tie a silk thread around its body, put the ant at one end of the hole and honey at the other end, and as the ant walks through the hole to get to the honey, it will take the silk thread with it. As for the drum, make a drum with sides of paper. put a bumblebee inside. As the bee tries to get out, it will bang against the paper. Not very rhythmically, but you will have a drum that makes noise without being beaten. The farmer was astonished. He ran to the castle to tell all of this to the Lord, but when he finished speaking, the Lord did not order his servants to start working on this. Instead, he stared at the farmer and said, "You are very young to be wiser than all of my wise men. Tell me the truth. Who has helped you with these puzzles?" The farmer could not lie. He said, "Sire, it was my aged mother. I have hidden her under my house these last 3 years. She is the one who solved the puzzles." Now he thought he would be punished. Now he thought the Lord would order his servants to throw him in the dungeon, but instead the Lord sat there thinking. And finally he said, "I have been wrong. I see now it is the aged among us who have wisdom and experience, and we should honor them." So he lifted the decree. The village became a happy place once again. Even Lord Higa was impressed. He said, "This village has much wisdom, and the people there should be allowed to live in peace." And that is exactly what the farmer, his mother, and all the villagers did all the days of their lives. Don't you love it when someone can say, "I have been wrong"? Once there was a village right by the sea, and in that village there lived a young boy named Taro. Now, Taro was not like the other boys in the village because he could not hear and he could not speak. He lived with his father, who took good care of him, and all the villagers knew him and helped him, and so Taro grew up happy and secure. Now, Taro's father was a fisherman, and he would take his boat out to sea and he would fish all night long. And in the morning, Taro would go down to the edge of the sea and help him to bring in the catch. But one bad night, his father took the boat far out to sea, and a great storm arose, and the winds howled, and the rains poured down. And in the morning, the fisherman did not come home. Taro stood by the edge of the water, staring out to sea, looking for any sign of his father's boat, but he never saw the boat again. He never saw his father again. He stood there all day, staring out to the water. In the early evening, he was still standing there, and an old man came down from the mountain. Everybody called him Oji-san, which means uncle. He knew Taro, and he knew that Taro was alone, and so he came up to the boy and he said, "Taro, you come home with me. You can live with me." And because the boy could not hear him, Oji-san took Taro by the hand, and in the warm circle of light from the lantern that he held, he led Taro up the mountain to his home. And from that day, Taro lived with Oji-san. Now, Oji-san was a fisherman too, and like the others, he fished all night long. And in the morning, Taro would go down to the edge of the sea to help him bring in the catch, but sometimes Taro would wake up extra early, and he would walk up the mountain to where there was a temple. He would stand there in the dark, early morning hours, waiting for the sun to rise and the flock of golden cranes that would fly overhead every morning. First, the sky would be black, and then red, and then orange, and then gold, shining gold, and the flock of golden cranes would fly overhead, their wings beating so loudly, and Taro would throw up his hands as if to say, "Oh, birds, you are so beautiful." One day, Oji-san arrived back to shore to find Taro waiting for him. The boy was obviously upset, and because he could not speak, he grabbed the old man by the hand and began to pull him up the mountain. Up and up they went, almost to the temple, and Oji-san looked down, and there in the road lay one golden crane, its wing injured. Carefully, Oji-san slid his arms under the bird. It did not fight him. He carried it home and laid it before his fire. He mixed up a paste of healing herbs and spread the paste on the injured wing. Taro knelt beside the bird and tried to feed it a piece of fish, but the bird would not eat. Every day, Taro knelt beside the bird. He stroked the bird's feathers. He breathed as the bird breathed. Finally, on the third day, the bird pecked at a piece of dried fish that Taro held out. Every day, he ate a little more. He was getting stronger. But by now, stories of this beautiful bird had spread throughout the village, and the people began to come one and two at a time to see the bird. No one had ever seen one of these beautiful birds up so close. One day, a wealthy merchant came. He wore robes of fine silk and rode a beautiful white horse. He knelt beside the bird and stared at it. He brought out a chest. He offered Oji-san this chest of gold in exchange for the bird. Oji-san lifted the lid. The gold coin shone almost as brightly as the bird itself. But he shook his head no. I cannot sell you this bird. It does not belong to me. And he sent the merchant away. A few days later, the lord of the region came. He knelt beside the bird and stared at it and thought about the golden cage he would build to hold it. He offered to make Oji-san headman of the entire village in exchange for the bird. But Oji-san said, "No, this bird is a wild creature. It must be free. I cannot sell this bird to you." And he sent the lord away. Every day, the bird was eating more. He was getting stronger. Soon he would be able to fly. But by now, stories of this beautiful bird had spread all the way to the emperor. And the emperor decided that such a bird, so beautiful, so rare, so unique, should only belong to an emperor. He sent word to the village that he, the emperor himself, would arrive at the village in 2 weeks' time at sunrise to collect the bird. Oji-san knew he must obey. No one dared say no to the emperor. The entire village went into a frenzy of excitement to think that the emperor himself, was coming to their tiny village. Everything was cleaned and made ready. And on the appointed morning, in the dark, early morning hours, the entire village stood by the side of the road. Taro and Oji-san stood there. The golden crane lay beside them in the road. And everyone listened. And through the darkness, they began to hear the muffled sound of hoofbeats getting closer and closer. And everyone turned and looked down the road to see the rows of the soldiers carrying the banners and the rows of men on horseback, and finally the emperor himself riding a huge black horse. And at that moment, the first rays of the sun appeared over the horizon, and the sky turned from black to red to orange to gold, shining gold, and the flock of golden cranes flew overhead, and suddenly the entire flock turned and flew straight towards the village. The wings so bright and blinding, the people fell to their knees. The soldiers turned away. Even the emperor closed his eyes. All they could hear was the sound of beating wings, and then a boy's voice crying aloud, "Oh, birds, you are so beautiful." Gradually, the sound of wings faded. The people stood one by one. The soldiers turned. The emperor looked. But the golden crane was gone. Gone, too, were Taro and Oji-san. They had been carried by the flock of golden cranes into the light of the rising sun. Now, in Japan, the biggest holiday of the year is New Year's Day, January 1st. On New Year's Day, you want to have your whole house cleaned from top to bottom. You want to have all your debts paid off. and you want to cook up a big feast and visit with friends and family. And there are those who still believe in the custom of Hatsuyume, the first dream of the new year. It is thought that the first dream you have can predict how your entire year will go. So everyone wants to have a good and prosperous dream for their first dream. Well, once there were two men who were neighbors. One man was very hard-working and honest, a very good man. And the other man was mean and greedy. Well, one day, just before New Year's, the two neighbors met by the side of the road and started talking. And they agreed to meet again after New Year's and compare their first dreams. So a few days later, they met again. The good man said, "I had a wonderful dream. I dreamt that luck came to me from heaven." The greedy man said, "Oh, I had a very good dream too. I dreamt that luck came to me from the earth." "Well," said the good man, "we'll have to see if our dreams come true." Later on that day, the good man was digging in his field and his shovel hit something hard. So he kept on digging and he uncovered a great big pot with a lid on it. He dragged it up, lifted the lid, and inside the pot, it was filled with gold and silver coins. He thought, "This must be the luck from my neighbor. It comes from the earth. I must tell him about it." So he put the lid back on, pot in the ground, covered it up with dirt carefully so no one else would find it. And he went off to tell his neighbor. The greedy man was very happy to hear this news. But when he went to the field later on and dug up the pot, he lifted the lid, and inside the pot, what did he see but a pile of writhing, hissing snakes? He flew into a rage. He said, "My neighbor thinks he can play a trick on me. He thinks this is funny. Well, I'll show him." And he put the lid on the pot, and he took the pot home. Late that night, when it was very dark, the greedy man took the pot and a ladder and went over to the good man's house. He leaned the ladder on the side of the house and went up to the roof with the pot. He went over to the chimney and looked down, and he could see the good man and his wife sitting at the table eating their supper. The greedy man took the lid off the pot and then turned it upside down and said, "Here's your joke," and he shook the contents of the pot into the chimney. Inside, the good man heard a noise coming from above. He looked up just in time to see a shower of gold and silver coins coming down the chimney. "Look," he said to his wife, "here is our luck from heaven." And so, the good man and his wife lived happily to the end of their days. You know, at least in stories, the good people get rewarded and the villains get punished. Oh, that it were like that in real life. Well, the next story is actually my favorite of all Japanese folktales. So, and among folktales, this has been my signature story. I've been telling it as long as I've been a storyteller. It is a very old, very classic Japanese story. There are many versions of it. So here's the way I tell it. It's called The Crane Wife. Once long ago, there was a poor man by the name of Yoshio. He lived all alone in the home his parents had left to him when they had died. On a cold and wintry day, Yoshio was walking down a snowy path when he looked to the side and he saw a large trap. And caught in the trap was a great white crane, its feathers fluttering as it tried to break free. "Oh, poor bird," said Yoshio. "You will die if I do not help you." He walked over to the trap, bent down, and a man came running up. He said, "What are you doing? That's my bird." Yoshio said, "I was only trying to help it. Here, take this money. It's all I have. Sell the bird to me." Well, the man was satisfied. And after he left, Yoshio bent over the trap again, and he freed the bird. He stepped back and watched as the bird rose into the sky. It circled over his head 3 times and flew off toward the mountains, and Yosho watched it until it was so small he could see it no more. And then he turned, and he went home. Late that night, he heard a knocking at his door. Who could it be so late? When he slid the door open, there, to his amazement, stood a beautiful young woman, shivering with cold, for she was wearing only a thin kimono. "Please, sir," she said, "I've lost my way. Might I come in and sit by your fire?" Quickly he invited her in. She stayed that night and the next 3, for it snowed so hard she could not leave, but by then he did not want her to leave. She was so beautiful, so gentle. He had fallen in love with her that very first night. One day she said, "Yosho, why don't we marry?" And so they became husband and wife. And Yosho was happier than he had ever been. The woman was kind, and his formerly dark house seemed to be filled with light. But they were very poor. He had little to begin with, and now there were 2 mouths to feed. One day she said, "I see that the other wives in the village have looms with which to weave cloth. I know how to weave. I could weave for you." Now Yosho did have a loom in the house, for his mother had been a weaver before she had died. So he set up the loom in a back room, and before she went into the room, she said, "Now, you must not look at me while I'm weaving." Thinking she needed to be alone to concentrate on her work, he gave his promise. She went into the room, closed the doors, and he could hear the sound of the loom, tong-kata, 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 tong-kata. For 1 whole day and 1 whole night, the sound of the loom never stopped. She didn't eat or sleep. When she finally appeared the next morning, she looked pale and weak, but in her hands she carried a bolt of fabric more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen. He took the cloth in his hands. The colors seemed to glow with a lustrous light. He lifted up one corner. It was as light and as delicate as a feather. He took the cloth to town and sold it for a great deal of money, and they lived together well for a while. But the winter dragged on and on. There was no work to be had. He didn't want to ask her to weave again, but one day she said, "I'll weave just 1 more time, but this will be the last. And remember, you must not look at me while I'm weaving." She went into the room. He could hear the sound of the loom for 2 days and 2 nights, and when she finally appeared, she was so weak she could barely stand. But the cloth in her hands was so beautiful, it took his breath away. This time he took the cloth to the lord of the village, who gave him 10 gold coins. Now they lived together very well. But only a few days later, the Lord sent a messenger, and the message was this: "You have sold me the finest cloth in all of Japan. I want another piece like it. And if you bring it to me, I'll give you 100 pieces of gold." As the messenger spoke, Yosho could see the gold coins dancing before his eyes. But when he told his wife, she was puzzled. Why would anyone want that much money? So he said no more. But from that day, all he could think about was the gold. Whether awake or asleep, all he could see were those gold coins shimmering before his eyes. He seemed so unhappy that finally she said, "Very well, I'll weave 1 more time, but this will be the last. And for the sake of heaven, do not look at me while I'm weaving." She went into the room. Yosho rubbed his hands together with anticipation and sat down to wait. Tong-kata, 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 tong-kata. For 3 whole days and 3 whole nights, the sound of the loom never stopped, and Yosho, sitting there, began to wonder. Why did she always look so pale and weak each time she wove? How could she make such beautiful cloth when she never seemed to buy any thread? What was going on behind those doors? And the more he sat, the more he wondered, until finally he couldn't stand it anymore. He got up, forgetting his promise, walked to the doors, pushed them aside, and froze with horror. For the sight that met his eyes was not human. It was a great white crane sitting at the loom, its chest smeared with blood. For with its beak, it was pulling out its own feathers and placing them in the loom. Yosho gave a cry and fell away from the doorway in a faint. When he opened his eyes, there beside him was a bolt of fabric, the white cloth shining white upon white upon white, with a thread of bright crimson running through it in a pattern as delicate as tears. And he heard a voice. I had hoped that we could live together forever, but now that you have seen me as I truly am, I can no longer stay in the world of humans. I am the crane you rescued that day on the snowy path. I came to repay your kindness. I loved your generous heart, but now I must leave. Yosho stumbled outside just in time to see a great white crane rising into the sky. It circled over his head 3 times and flew off toward the mountains, and Yosho watched it until it was so small he could see it no more. I used to think that she left because he was greedy. But then I read a book of Japanese folklore, and she left because he discovered her true nature. And that is not allowed. There is a whole genre of folktales in Japanese folklore where men marry women who are not as they seem. Sometimes she's a fox, sometimes she's a bird, and usually she leaves because he has broken a promise or he has broken a taboo. Japanese love sad stories. So it's a whole genre, the animal wife tale. I think we should have a demon, don't you think? Well, once there was a farmer. He lived all alone on his small farm because he had never gotten married, even though he was getting up towards middle age. His friends in the village, the other farmers, would say, you ought to get married. You could have a wife, a companion in life, someone to share the good times and hard times with. You could have a family. Children would bring you so much joy. But you see, the farmer was a rather greedy man. He simply did not want to share anything that he had. He said, if I had a wife, she would spend all my money. She would eat me out of house and home. But they kept nagging and nagging and nagging him until finally one day he said, well, I suppose I could get married if I could find a woman who did not eat. Well, after that, they left him alone. But only a few nights later, he heard a knocking at his door, and when he slid the door open, there stood a beautiful young woman. She had lustrous black hair, white skin, and a tiny red mouth. Oh, sir, she said, I'm so tired. I've been walking all day. Could I come in and rest? Perhaps I could spend the night. The farmer looked at her and said, well, you can come in. You can even spend the night, but I'm not going to give you any food. Oh, that's all right, sir, she said. I don't eat. Well, she did come in, and she did spend the night, and the next morning, when the farmer opened up his eyes, he could smell food cooking. So he went into the kitchen, and there she was. Oh, kind sir, I have made you breakfast. He looked at the table. There was soup, rice, fish. He said, remember, I'm not going to give you any food. Oh, that's all right, sir. I don't eat. Well, he ate a delicious breakfast, and then he went out to the fields as usual to work, and he worked all day. And when he came home at night and went in his house, there she was. Oh, kind sir, I have made you supper. He looked at the table. There was a delicious-looking supper, and then he looked around his house. Everything looked neat and clean. It looked like she had been spending hours cleaning his house. Now he was starting to feel just a little bit guilty that she'd been doing all this work, and he hadn't fed her. So he said, rather begrudgingly, well, you could have some food. Oh, no, sir. I don't eat. Well, it went on like that. She never left. She cooked, she cleaned, she did his laundry, and the days went by, and the farmer thought, she's beautiful, she works hard, and she doesn't eat. I have found the perfect woman. I'm going to ask her to marry me. And he did, and she said yes. Well, the farmer had never been happier. He was so happy, he bragged about her to all his friends. They were not so happy. A woman who doesn't eat, that's not normal. Perhaps you have married an evil spirit. Perhaps you have married a demon. Well, now the farmer was worried. It's true, it wasn't normal. He would have to investigate. So the next day when he came home from the fields, he did not go into the door of his house. He went to the side of the house and peeked in the window. There was his beautiful wife. She was sweeping the floor, humming a little tune to herself. There was a huge pot of something cooking over the fire. The farmer thought, why is she making so much food? Well, she finished her sweeping, put the broom to the side, and went and got the pot. It was a pot of rice, and she brought it over and put it on the table, and then she lifted the lid and took her shamoji, her rice paddle, and she began to fluff up the rice, and she began to make rice balls. But she wasn't making normal-sized rice balls. She was making great, big, huge rice balls bigger than a baby's head. She put the first rice ball on the table and began to make a second rice ball. She was lining the rice balls on the table. The farmer thought, why is she making so much food? Who is going to eat all of that food? And then, before his unbelieving eyes, she reached up and parted the hair at the top of her head. And there, at the top of her head, was a huge, huge mouth with red, red lips. And she picked up one of the rice balls and threw it in the mouth, and the mouth began to chew. Yum, yum, yum. She picked up the second rice ball and threw it in the mouth. Yum, yum, yum. The farmer felt sick. What have I done? I've married a demon. And where did she get all that rice? Well, he ran to the storehouse to find that almost all of his rice was gone. This was almost worse than marrying a demon. He thought, I have to get rid of her, but I must be careful. I don't want her to be angry with me. I don't want her to hurt me. So he calmed himself down, and then he went back to his door, and he walked in the house. There was his beautiful wife. Oh, husband, you're home. I have your supper all ready for you. He said, wife, I have been thinking. I'm not happy. I want a divorce. Oh, she said, that's too bad. I suppose I should be leaving. Oh, he was relieved. Maybe she would leave peacefully. Well, she said, when I leave, I would like to take one thing with me. Oh, yes, he said, anything at all. Take anything you want. Well, I would like to take the bathtub. Now, I know what you're thinking. In our homes, bathtubs are big, heavy ceramic things firmly attached to the wall. But this was old Japan. He had a bathhouse, and the bathtub was a round wooden tub with a wooden lid on it. He said, yes, take the bathtub, take it. And then, as he stared at her, she began to change. She got taller, and her beautiful face turned ugly and wrinkled, and her hair was white and wild. Her eyes glowed with an unholy red light. She was Yamanba, the mountain hag. He stared at her in shock. She ran up to him. She grabbed him by the neck. She had the strength of 10 men, and she ran with him to the bathhouse. She lifted the lid to the bathtub, threw him in, lid back on, and she took the bathtub and began to run up the side of the mountain. Well, the farmer tried to get out, but she kept shifting the bathtub this way and that. He couldn't get a grip. He couldn't even push the lid up. Well, she ran for an hour, for 2 hours, and finally she got tired. So she stopped. She put the bathtub down. She leaned against a tree, sat down, and she went to sleep. And the farmer felt everything get still, and he pushed up the lid, and he could see her sleeping against the tree. So carefully, he climbed out and put the lid back. She began to stir. Oh, quickly, he climbed the tree. She woke up and stretched. picked up the bathtub. Oh, it's so light now. That's what a good rest will do. And she began to run up the mountain to her mountain home. But when she put the bathtub down and lifted the lid, where is he? And she ran down the mountain looking for him. Well, the farmer had climbed down from the tree and dived into a big field of mugwort plants. He knew that people believed that demons and spirits hate the smell of mugwort, so he had dived deep into the mugwort plants. The Yamamba came running into the field, but she couldn't stand the smell, and finally she gave up and she went home. The farmer went home too. He hung mugwort plants all around his house. But from that day, the Yamamba never bothered him. And I have also heard that from that day, the farmer never got married again. Now, this next story is based on an old legend, which means that it has true roots, and it was collected by a man named Lafcadio Hearn, who was an American who went to Japan. He was a journalist. He was about 40 when he went to Japan. Well, he must have loved it, because as far as I can tell, he never came back. He took on a Japanese name. He married a Japanese woman. He became Buddhist, and he wrote books about the people and the culture that he found. And so he collected this legend. It was published in his book, Gleanings in Buddha Fields, in the late 1800s. It's called The Wave. There was a small village by the sea, just 90 thatched houses nestled at the base of a mountain. The people there grew rice, and you could see the rice fields all around and even going up the side of the mountain like green terraced steps. Above the people's rice fields was a large temple where they would worship. And above the temple, the largest house in the village. It belonged to an old man named Gohei Hamaguchi. Hamaguchi-san lived there with his grandson Tada. He was the head man of the village and the wealthiest of all the villagers. He was so beloved, the people called him Oji-san, which means grandfather. He was very wise. He would help them with their problems, and he would give advice and sometimes money. It was on a fall day, Oji-san was standing on the veranda of his house. And from that place, he could look all the way down the mountain and see the entire village. First, his own rice fields. The rice had been cut and gathered into stacks at the end of every row. It had been a good harvest. Such a good harvest that people were planning to celebrate that night with a festival. He could see the temple with the banners and the lanterns hanging in readiness for the celebration. He could see the people's rice fields, their houses, the beach, and finally, the sea. The air was warm and strangely heavy. It was earthquake weather. And as he stood there on the veranda, he began to feel the slow shaking of an earthquake. Now, he was not alarmed. They lived through several earthquakes every year, but this one seemed different. The shaking started deep, deep below the surface of the earth. The earth shook and stilled. And then Oji-san looked out at the water of the ocean, and he saw something he'd never seen before. The water was moving in the wrong direction. The water was pulling away from the land. It looked like the water was running away from the land. The people in the village were beginning to notice this strange sight. They were gathering down on the beach, talking to each other, pointing out to the water. No one had ever seen this before. No one knew what it meant. But Oji-san, standing there, began to remember when he was a little boy, his grandfather telling him of the very same thing happening when he was a little boy. And Oji-san knew what was to come. It was great danger. But there was no time to run all the way down the mountain to warn the people. There was no time even to get to the temple to ask the priest to ring the bell. He turned to his grandson. Tada, he said, light me a torch. The boy obeyed immediately, bringing a lit pine torch. Oji-san took the torch and ran down to the edge of his first rice field. He hesitated for only a moment, looking at all his work for the past year, all his wealth. And then he raised the torch and he lit the first rice stack. Immediately, it burst into flame, the black smoke billowing into the air. He did not hesitate, but ran to the second row and lit that stack and ran to the third row. Tada ran beside him, crying, "Ji-chan, Ji-chan, what are you doing? What are you doing?" The old man did not answer, just kept lighting stack after stack, row after row. Tada ran back to the house weeping. He thought his grandfather had gone crazy. Finally, the old man had lit the last stack. He dropped his torch. He went back to his veranda, and he waited. It was a priest at the temple who first saw the black smoke rising. Ah, he thought, Oji-san's rice fields are burning. We must help. And he began to ring the bell over and over and over until finally the people who were still standing on the beach, still pointing out to the water, which was still pulling away from the land. At last the people turned and looked up the mountain and saw the black smoke rising. Ah! Oji-san's rice fields are burning, we must help. And they began to run up the mountain, every man, woman, and child, for the old man was well loved. It was the young men and women who reached him first. Water, they said, where's the water? We'll help you put out the fire. But he said, no, let the fields burn. What? Let the fields burn? But why? There is great danger, he said. Everyone must come, everyone. And gradually, they did all come. The children running up, the young mothers with the babies upon their backs, and finally the old people leaning upon their canes. And when he saw that everyone was there, he said, yes, I lit my rice fields. Look to the sea. And everyone turned and looked at the water, still pulling away from the land. And then, before their unbelieving eyes, the water rose up into a solid wall of water, high, higher, impossibly high. And that wall of water began to rush towards the shore, tsunami, the great wave. And that wall of water crashed on the beach, sending the wood from their houses flying. And then it pulled back once more and rose up into a solid wall that rushed towards the shore and crashed upon the beach 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, but growing weaker and weaker until finally the water settled itself back in its ocean bed, dark and uneasy. And the people looked at the wreckage of their houses at the beach where only moments before they had been standing. That, said Oji-san, that is why I burnt my rice fields. And one by one the people turned. And one by one they sank to their knees and bowed to the old man who stood before them, once the wealthiest of them all, now a poor man. But he had saved 400 lives. Come, he said, my house still stands, and the temple too. There is room for many. Come. And he turned, and he led the way. Thank you so much for being here today. Does anyone have a question for me? Anything you'd like to ask?
How do you remember all these?
Yes, you know what? Here's the thing. I didn't memorize them word for word.